The cold seat behind the curtained wind was sharp that morning on set. A bitter wind that didn't match the California sun. The film was a high-stakes action drama, a massive production, backed by one of Hollywood's biggest studios. Cameras, cranes, lights, and crew moved like parts of a machine, but somewhere behind that perfect choreography, a heart was breaking quietly. Ana de Armas sat alone on a metal bench, tucked behind the wardrobe trailer. Her makeup had been done 2 hours ago, but it didn't matter. Now her hands rested in her lap, holding the folded call sheet that no longer had her name on it. Had been cut not because of her talent, not because of a mistake, but because someone higher up had made a last-minute call to change direction. The studio had brought in a new producer, a man who believed she didn't fit the new tone. He wanted a different energy, someone who could draw a different demographic. It wasn't personal. It was just business. Those words meant nothing to Ana at that moment. For weeks she had poured her soul into the character, studied her lines, rehearsed stunts, bruised her knees, stayed up late reviewing scenes. And now she was out like an extra, never meant to be there in the first place. No public announcement, no meeting, just a quiet whisper from an assistant who handed her a revised schedule with her name missing and eyes that couldn't hold her. Sana had smiled, thanked the assistant, and walked away with grace. But once out of sight, she sank onto the bench behind the wardrobe trailer and let the weight fall. She didn't cry, not yet. She just sat still, breathing, trying to hold herself together. And that's when Keanu Reeves saw her. Had arrived early that day, a habit he'd never lost from years of treating every set like sacred ground. He believed in preparation, respect, and being invisible until needed. Was walking toward the makeup trailer when he caught a glimpse of someone sitting alone. The body language was unmistakable. Shoulders folded inward, head slightly lower, the kind of posture that only came when someone was trying not to be seen. Keanu paused, stepped back, and looked again. It was Ana. He walked toward her quietly, careful not to startle her, and stood nearby until she noticed him. She looked up slowly, trying to pull herself together to quickly. Keanu sat beside her without saying a word. For a while they just sat there in silence, the metal bench cold beneath them, the sky bright. For how she felt. Finally she spoke, her voice soft and dry. Guess I'm not needed anymore. Keanu turned to her gently. Who told you that? Held up the folded call sheet and gave a quiet laugh, meant to hide the hurt. They changed direction, new producer, new tone, new vision, just not new enough to include me. Keanu looked at the paper, then back at Harry. Seen producers change entire stories overnight, but the real stories, the ones that matter, aren't written on call sheets. Ana smiled a little, but it didn't reach her eyes. Keanu continued, you gave this your heart. You showed up. You worked harder than most do when they know they'll be seen, and now you're being told to disappear. But the thing about people like you is you never really disappear. She looked at him, unsure what to say. He added quietly, sometimes it's not the scene that changes, it's the people who fail to see what was already perfect. Keanu stood slowly, reached into his jacket, and pulled out a small folded piece of paper, handed it to her. What's this? She escaped a smile. Just something to hold on to when you feel invisible. She unfolded it and read, true power is not in what others give you, it is in what they cannot take away. When she looked up, he was already walking away toward set, like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just seen her in the one moment she had hoped no one would. Ana held the note tightly in her hand like a lifeline. Hers passed, and she stayed on set watching from a distance. She wasn't required to be there anymore, but something in her didn't want to leave, not yet. Watched Keanu film his scenes. He was precise, kind of the crew, always thanking the lighting team, always checking on the stunt coordinators. He never shouted, never acted superior. He moved with purpose, but without pretty. During breaks, he made eye contact with every crew member, as if reminding them they were just as important as the actors. At one point, he noticed Ana still sitting near the edge of the sound stage and walked over again. Still here, he sketched, nodded. He thought about leaving, but I didn't want to walk away like this. Sat down next to her again, this time bringing 2 cups of coffee, one for her, one for him. Sometimes staying is the stronger thing, he said, and sometimes just showing up is the victor. Ana smiled. This time it was real, even if small. Keanu looked out at the set, then leaned a little. Though, you know how many times I've been told I wasn't right for something that I didn't belong at. My face didn't match the box they had drawn. She raised an eyebrow. Yeah, we nodded, more than I can count. But the thing is, when you don't fit in their box, it's usually because you were never meant to be in one to begin with. He sat there talking about everything but the movie, about childhood heartbreaks, embarrassing auditions, long flights, and small victories. When Ana finally stood up to leave, Keanu stood too. Thank you, she said. For what? For seeing me. Smiled again, not a big movie star smile, just the kind that said he truly meant it. He didn't do anything special. He said you sat when I needed it most, she replied, and that's everything's left the set quietly that evening. the folded call sheet still in her pocket, but now with Keanu's note beside it. What she didn't know yet was that this moment of loss was not the end of her story. In fact, it was the beginning, because someone had seen what the new producer had missed. Someone had been watching from the shadows, not just her performance, but her discipline, her grace, her ability to carry pain without showing it. And that someone was about to make a decision that would change everything. Asterisk, the call that no one expected. Sun hadn't risen yet, but the city was already awake. The streets were still half asleep, and the air was thick with fog. But inside one quiet apartment, a phone buzzed on a nightstand, breaking the early morning silence. The Armas turned over slowly, her eyes still swollen from sleep. The night before had been heavy. She had gone home with a hollow feeling, the kind that doesn't fully leave even with rest. She had planned to take the next few days off, to think, to breathe, to forget it. The phone kept buzzing. Unknown number. Stared at it for a moment, debating whether to answer, then pressed the green button. Hello, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. A voice responded, clear and professional. Good morning, Miss de Armas. This is Sandra McKenna, assistant director to Mr. Elliot Hawthorne. He'd like to speak with you. Anna sat up instantly. Elliot Hawthorne was not just any director. He was one of the most respected names in the industry, the kind of man who didn't waste time on things he didn't believe in. Yes, of course, she replied. Starletta paused, then the voice changed, this time calm, older, thoughtful. Anna, this is Elliot Hawthorne. I saw your footage from the first week of shooting. Blinked, unsure how to respond. He wasn't supposed to see it, but someone made sure it landed on my desk yesterday, and I watched it twice. Swallowed hard. You deities, and I need you to know something. You weren't just good, you were unforgettable. Lena didn't speak, afraid. This was a dream. You've directed over 30 films, Anna, but what I saw in your performance was real. It wasn't just acting, it was life, and we don't see that often. Thank you, she whispered, still unsure what was happening. I'm starting a new project. He continued, something deeply personal, and I want you to audition for the lead role. We're rewriting the script now, but I'll have my team send you the details by noon. Anna couldn't believe what she was hearing. The same week she was cut from one film, she was being offered a chance at something even bigger, and she had no doubt who had made sure her footage landed on Elliot Hawthorne's desk. He knew. After the call ended, she sat on her bed staring at her phone for a long time, 100 thoughts rushing through her heart all at once. He didn't have to do things, didn't even say he would, but he did. By noon, the script arrived, and by evening, she was sitting in her living room reading it line by line. It was raw, emotional, deep, the kind of story that scares you because it feels too close to real life. Ash called the number she was given and confirmed she would audition. The next few days moved like a blur. She rehearsed lines with the coach, worked on emotional beats, tried different takes at practice scenes that pulled things from her soul she had never shared before. In the day of the audition, she walked into the studio quietly, wearing simple clothes, no makeup, just her real self. Elliot Hawthorne was already there waiting. You don't need to impress me, he said as she entered. I just want to see you. Be honest. Nodded, then stood under the light and started. 3 minutes in the room was silent. Even the camera operator had paused his breath, and when she finished, there was no applause, only a long pause. Elliot stood slowly and walked toward Harry. You just told my story better than I ever could, he said. A week later, Anna got the part, but even then, she didn't post about it. She didn't announce it to anyone. She simply called. Keanu answered after the second ring. It's me, she said softly. No, his voice was warm. You sent the footage, didn't you? He just made sure the right eyes saw what was already there. Thank you. I don't owe me anything, maybe not, but I want you to know something. Was that when I was sitting alone that day, I felt small, like the work I had done meant nothing. But then you sat down next to me and reminded me that value isn't given, it's lived. Keanu didn't say much, but Anna could hear the quiet in his voice, the kind of silence that holds truth. In the weeks that followed, they both went back to their lives. Anna began training for the new role. The film was emotionally demanding and required her to access parts of herself she had long protected, worked day and night rewriting parts of herself just to understand the woman she was now playing. In every now and then she'd get a short message from Keanu. As your heart and forget to breathe. Your strength is louder than your doubts. They weren't long messages, but they always came when she needed them. Meanwhile, word began to spread in the industry about the upcoming film, not because of its budget or cast, but because people were whispering about Anna's performance before it was even finished. Some who had been on the previous film set were stunned to hear she was back on screen so soon. They had expected her to disappear after being cut, but instead she was rising stronger than ever. And the director who had cut her, the one who chose a different face for a different tone, he heard about it too, watched her early trailers in silence, and couldn't deny I that made a Mr. Keanu never spoke about what he had done. No interviews, no quotes, no stories, but crew members knew what happened. Word travels fast on a set, and soon everyone knew that Keanu Reeves had made one quiet choice. That changed everything for someone. Elsina didn't ride on fame, or Favorsh walked with dignity, and let her work speak. Day filming wrapped on Elliot Hawthorne's film. The crew surprised her with something she hadn't expected. They had all written short notes on scraps of paper, folded them, and placed them in a box labeled "For Honor, the one who reminded us why we love Storyish." Opened the box slowly and read each note. One said, "Your kindness was louder than any spotlight." Another said, "You helped me believe in myself again." One simply said, "Thank you for not quitting." Anna sat there reading every message, her eyes full of tears, not for the fame or success, but because people had seen her not as a product, but as a person. That evening, she sent a voice message to Keanu. "Gave me a box full of thank you note testing." Not surprised, he repeated, "We not because you earned every word." Keanu was sitting at home, quietly sipping tea, when he listened to her message, and for the first time in a long time, he smiled to himself, not because of a movie, not because of a scene, but because someone he believed in had stepped into her own light. What neither of them knew yet was that this was only the beginning, because the film they had just finished would go on to do something that even the studios didn't expect. It would touch hearts in places no blockbuster had reached, and the world would soon learn what happens when one person refuses to let another disappear. Asterisk. The premiere that changed everything. Night of the premiere arrived quietly. The sky over Los Angeles was soft and silver with stars. The red carpet stretched out under flashing lights. But Ana de Armas didn't feel like a star. She felt like someone stepping into the unknown. Film she had poured herself into was finally complete. The same film that had started with a phone call from a stranger. The same film that had healed something inside her and also awakened something she had buried. As she stepped out of the black car and stood under the cameras, people called her name, but all she could hear was the quiet in her own heart. Her dress was simple but elegant, and her eyes searched for just one face in the crowd, and there he was. Keanu stood at the far end of the carpet, not in a tuxedo, not making any noise, just smiling softly like someone who knew something no one else did. Didn't rush toward her or pull attention. He simply nodded, and that was Anna. Fana smiled back and walked forward, each step steadier than the last. Inside the theater, the lights dimmed and the room fell silent. The screen came alive, and the story began. For the next 2 hours, no one spoke. They watched as Anna's character unraveled, then rebuilt. They watched her crying, not the kind of crying that seeks pity, but the kind that reveals truth. They watched her lose everything in the film and still walk forward with quiet power. And when the credits rolled, the audience did something rare. They didn't clap right away. They just sat in silence, holding what they had seen, and then slowly the applause began. Not polite, not forced, but real. People stood. They didn't just clap, they rose to their feet. Elliot Hawthorne stood too, his eyes filled with pity. He leaned toward Anna and whispered, "You gave them something they didn't know they needed." After the film, the after party buzzed with praise. Actors, directors, critics, and strangers approached Anna again and again. "How did you do it? Where did that performance come from?" "You just raised the bar." Anna smiled politely, thanked them, but never let it rise to her head. She stepped outside for air and found Keanu already waiting there, leaning against a quiet wall, sipping water like he always did. "You okay?" He sketched, nodded, still soaking it all in. He said, "I was powerful in the film." She whispered back, "As you were." He replied. She turned to him, eyes soft. "Do you think my pain made me better?" Looked at her carefully. "No, I think your strength did." They didn't need to say much more. They just stood side by side in the cool air. Soon word began to spread. The reviews came in, and they were glowing. Critics called it the career-defining role. Audiences wrote, "Let us say in the film helped them heal," and Anna's name was now on every screen, every article, every headline. But still she remembered the metal bench behind the trailer. Still she remembered the folded call sheet with her name missing. Still she remembered the quiet moment when someone sat beside her without needing to say anything loud. On afternoon, weeks later, she received a message from the director who had once cut hair. It was short and honestly, "Saw the film. I see now what I missed. I'm sorry." Anna didn't reply, not out of anger, but because she didn't need those some apologies, or better left floating in silence. Around that same time, she was invited to speak at a film school, a place where young actors and actresses were still learning how to believe in themselves. As she stood on the stage, the students leaned forward, waiting. She looked at them and said, "I'm not here to teach you how to be stars. I'm here to remind you that it's okay to be invisible for a while, because sometimes when you feel forgotten, you're actually becoming the person you were meant to be." Listen, not because of her fame, but because she spoke from a place deeper than the spotlight. After The top one still raised a hand what kept you going when it felt like no one believed in you. Anna smiled gently. One person did, and that was Keanu never asked for credit, but people began to whisper his name anyway. Crew members told stories of how he stayed late to help, how he remembered birthdays, how he once bought lunch for a crew of 50 and never mentioned it, but what meant more to Anna than any award or review was the ripple that began to follow young women from small towns. Wrote her letters, maids, nurses, teachers, students. They said you made me feel seen. Your story gave me strength. I was about to give up, but then I watched your filming. So Anna decided to do something new, and Keanu quietly launched a mentorship program. Not a big flashy one, but something real for women in the industry who felt like they didn't belong, who had been told no, who had been cut before they were even seen. They called it the Quiet Light Initiative, because sometimes the softest lights shine the longest. They held workshops behind the scenes, taught how to hold pain without breaking, how to stand in rooms where your voice shakes, how to keep showing up even when no one claps, and slowly women began to rise, not louder, but stronger. Anna watched it all unfold with quiet pride. Remembered one particular girl from the program, a shy assistant costume designer named Leela, who once told Harry, always hide in the background because I don't think I'm hotter. Anna replied, some of the strongest stories begin in the background. Months later, Leela got promoted not because of her connections, but because someone finally saw her work, just like Keanu had once seen ages like Anna now saw others. Next film Anna worked on was different. She was now offered lead roles, respected, trusted, but she never forgot who she was before the camera. A day on set, a young actor was cut from a scene. He sat on the edge of the soundstage, shoulders folded just like she once had. Anna saw him, walked over and sat beside him quietly. You okay? She escaped, looked up startled, then nodded slowly. Thank you for sitting with me, he said. You didn't have to. Smiled. Someone once did it for me. And in that moment, the circle completed itself, because greatness is not just what you do when you're seen, it's what you do when no one's looking. And the world was just beginning to see what happens when the kind hearts choose to lift others instead of stepping over them. Ana de Armas had once been cut from a film, but Nosh was cutting paths for others, and she was only just beginning. The fire behind her smelled as sun shone softly through the windows of the studio rehearsal room. As Ana de Armas stood barefoot on the polished wooden floor, the space was quiet. Only the distant hum of the city leaking through the walls was rehearsing for her next role, a historical drama filled with tension, silence, and raw emotion. It was different from anything she had done before, not loud or action-packed, but still heavy with truth. As she moved through the scene, guided only by memory and instinct, she felt something new, not fear, not uncertainty, but calm, the kind of calm that comes when you no longer act to prove something, but to express something. This version of Anna wasn't fighting to be seen anymore. She was learning how to see others more clearly. After the rehearsal ended, she sat quietly on the floor and looked at her phone. There were messages from people she had never met, handwritten letters scanned and sent by her team, fans from small towns, single mothers, veterans, and girls who had never dreamed someone like them could be on screen. They didn't say you're so famous or you're so beautiful. They said you made me believe I matter. You helped me stand up at work. I see myself in you. Anna closed her eyes and whispered a silent thank you to the girl she once was, the one who sat behind the trailer, holding the call sheet with her name crossed out. KeanuReeves visited the set later that day, not for work, but to say hello. He had just wrapped a film in Japan and had brought her a small gift, handed her a book bound in soft leather. The pages were blank. What's this? She asked with a curious smiley. A story you haven't written yet, he replied. They sat together for a few minutes outside the studio in the shade of a nearby tree. You've come a long way, he said. Anna nodded, but I still remember how it felt when I thought it was over. Good, he said quietly. Never forget that feeling will be case. That's the feeling that will keep you. They sat in silence, watching as young actors passed by, rehearsing lines or rushing between meetings. No one looked at them twice, and they liked it that way. Anna later returned to her apartment and opened the book Keanu had given her. She wrote only one sentence on the first page. It was cut, but I did not disappear. The next morning, Anna joined a panel discussion for young women in film. It was a private event, no cameras, just real talk, hosted in a small studio where folding chairs replaced fame and honesty replaced Polish. Shoni girl asked her, how do you keep going when the world keeps choosing someone else? Ina smiled and said, sometimes the world doesn't choose you because it's waiting to see if you'll choose yourself first. Another girl asked, were you ever scared people wouldn't care about your work every day? Anna replied, but I did the work anyway, because sometimes we work not to be celebrated, but to be ready when the moment finally arrives. Her words moved through the room like wind touching hearts quietly, but Deep While the Quiet Light initiative continued to grow women from around the world. Began applying costume assistants from Mexico, voice artists from India, screenwriters from South Africa, that all shared one thing: they had been silenced before, but not anymore. Keanu joined one of the sessions, quietly sitting in the back listening. As a young woman named Lena shared her stories, had been fired for asking for credit on a project she helped write. No one stood up for me, she said tearfully, and for a while I believed maybe I didn't deserve it. Tana took her hand and said, your story is the reason we're here. Keanu watched silently, pride in his heart, not for the success, not for the headlines, but for the fact that he had chosen to believe in someone who now believed in others. At night, Anna received a letter from a high school teacher in Texas. It read, showed your story to my class, not because you're a celebrity, but because you're a reminder that quiet strength is still strength. One of my students said she wants to act now, not because she wants fame, but because she wants to tell the truth. Anna framed the letter and placed it beside her script. But not everything was easy. On evening, she read a brutal review from a major critic who questioned her depth as an actress, who said she was more suited for roles that required less emotion, more glamour. Words stung not because they were true, but because they reminded her of the old doubts. Called Keanu that night. Without knowing what to say, he answered with his usual calm voice. I read it to he say, Dana doesn't know what it cost you to be this honest. Dana was quiet for a moment, then asked, do you ever wish you could go back and change things? Keanu took a breath. Sometimes, but then I remember that the things that almost broke me became the things that built me. Nina nodded on the other end of the line, tears slipping silently down her cheek. Thank you for always being there. I were always there, he replied. You just hadn't met yourself yet. After that call, Anna went back to her journal and wrote a second sentence on the next page. I cried, but I kept going. She returned to set the next day, more focused than ever, and delivered a performance that left the director speechless. Walked up to her after the take and said, I don't know what you tapped into, but that scene is going to change people. Smiled and replied, I just remembered who I am. And she did, because Anna had discovered something rare, a fire that burns quietly, a strength that doesn't need noise, a grace that doesn't need approval. And with each passing day, she gave it to others through her work, through her words, through her presence. Keanu continued his own quiet journey, supporting new talent, funding scholarships for underprivileged actors, showing up on sets, and reminding people that being kind is more powerful than being known. And Anna spoke less often now, not because they grew apart, but because they had grown roots, kind of connection that doesn't need constant watering, because it was planted in respect. Tana's latest film was submitted to festivals and nominated for several awards, but the award she held dearest was a hand-drawn card from a girl in Brazil who wrote, you helped me believe that being soft is not the same as being weakened. So Anna kept working, kept writing, kept showing up. She knew the industry could still be cruel, that people would still choose others over her, that some rooms would still not open books. She also knew that none of those things could define her, because she had learned the truth: you don't need a spotlight to matter, you only need to keep your light on. Asterisk the speech no one expected. Theater was quiet as the lights dimmed. The golden glow of the chandeliers reflected off polished marble floors, and the cameras stood ready, waiting to capture history. It was the night of the Golden Reel Awards, one of the most respected nights in the industry, the place where true storytellers were honored, not for box office numbers, but for heart, honesty, and impact. Tana de Armas sat in the third row, her dress a soft shade of silver, her fingers gently folded in her lap, her eyes calm, but not distant. She was present, had been nominated for Best Lead in a Drama for the film that changed everything, the one she almost never got to make the role. That had become more than just a performance, it had become a mirrorish glance to her left, where Keanu sat quietly, not as a nominee, but as someone who always showed up when it mattered most. He gave her a soft nod, and that was enough. Night moved forward, name after name, applause after applause, until the presenter stepped up and read the final category: Best Performance by a Lead Actress in a Drama. The room held its breath, and the winner is Ana de Armas. There was a long pause before she stood. It was as if time slowed. The applause rose, the crowd stood, and her heart stayed still. She walked to the stage slowly and gracefully, accepted the award, her fingers trembling just a little. The room was still waiting for her to speak, but she didn't start with words, she started with a breath in. She looked out across the sea of faces and said, this is for the girl who sat behind a trailer holding a call sheet with her name missing. There were murmurs in the crowd, but she kept going. This is for the woman who was told she didn't fit the tone, who was cut, not for lack of skill, but for being too quiet, too soft, too reeling. This is for the person who sat beside me when I felt like I didn't exist, and reminded me that I did. She paused, and looked at Keanu, smiled softly, his eyes full of something deeper. The pretended continuity once thought value came from roles, from scripts, from being chosen. But now I know the truth value comes from showing up, from choosing yourself, from believing you still matter when others forget you held the award high, not like a trophy, but like a torch that doesn't belong to me. It belongs to everyone who has ever been made to feel invisible. Thank you for seeing Meth. Applause rose again. But this time it wasn't just about the win. It was about what she stood for. When Anna returned to her seat, people reached out to her, touched her shoulder, shook her hand, whispered thank you in passing, but Keanu didn't say anything until they were outside in the cool night air, away from the flash of cameras. That was the most important thing you've ever said, he told her. She looked up at him with soft eyes. He meant every word, and I believed every word he repeated. After that night, the Quiet Light Initiative doubled and reached women from more than 20 countries. Joined the program. Stories poured in from nurses, teachers, artists, mothers, women who had lived their whole lives behind the curtain. Anna didn't just act anymore. She became a bridge, started hosting private gatherings where women could speak without being recorded. Story circles, she called them, safe rooms filled with cushions, tea, and honest eye. One night during one of these gatherings, a woman named Amina shared something that left the room in silence. I used to think I didn't matter because no one ever clapped for me, she said softly. But now I know my silence was not emptiness, it was a waiting place. And now I'm ready to speak. Anna sat beside her and simply held her hand. Outside, the world was loud, fast, full of opinions and filters, but inside those rooms, there was peace. Keanu continued to mentor young actors quietly behind the scenes. He never asked for credit, he never made speeches, but he showed up again and again. Once told Anna during a walk through the mountain, I was younger, I wanted to be unforgettable. Now I just want to be useful. And Anna understood that more than ever. They were both building something that didn't shine in the way the world expected, but it lit up everything. Around Themone Day, Anna received a call from a director who had once rejected her. He asked her to star in his next project, a high-budget thriller set to film across Europe. She smiled and politely declining, grateful for the offer. She said, but I've learned that the right story is not always the biggest one. Instead, she chose a smaller project, written by a first-time screenwriter, a woman from Argentina, who had once been part of the Quiet Light Circle. Film told the story of a migrant mother raising a child with a disability in a foreign land. Anna read the script and agreed, this is the story I was meant to tell. She said Keanu supported her fully, even helping co-produce the project to ensure the message was protected. And when the film released, it didn't make millions, but it made a difference. Sepple wrote in saying, it helped them reconnect with their mothers, it helped them forgive, it helped them feel seen. And Anna knew she had found something better than Famesh had found purpose. Months later, during a casual evening at the foundation, Anna and Keanu sat on a bench, watching the sunset. It's strange, Anna said, how everything changed because you handed me a note. Keanu looked out at the sky and said softly, it wasn't the note, it was the woman who chose to read it and still keep going. Anna leaned back, smiled, and Sadie, think we're both proof that the quietest choices often carry the loudest echo. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they sat together, not needing to say more, because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones written not in headlines or scripts, but in the still moments between the people who chose to believe in each other. Asterisk. The legacy written in silence. The world had changed in quiet ways since that day behind the wardrobe trailer. The day Ana de Armas sat alone with a folded call sheet and a fading sense of worth. What began as a single act of kindness from Keanu had turned into something much larger than either of them had imagined. Years had passed, but the story still whispered through the film industry, through classrooms and coffee shops, whispered in the voice of women who had once been silenced, but now stood taller because someone like them had been seen. Anna walked slowly down a quiet hallway inside a small theater, not the kind that held red carpets or flashy lights, but the kind filled with warm wooden seats and the smell of old curtains. Tonight was the opening night of a new initiative under the Quiet Light Foundation, a storytelling series, real stories told live by women who had never held a microphone before. No cameras, no makeup, just truth. Anna stood behind the curtain and watched as the first speaker took the stage, a former hotel cleaner who shared how she once wrote poems in her head while changing sheets. She had never read them to anyone until tonight. Anna listened with her heart full. She didn't need to be on stage anymore. She just wanted to keep the stage open. After the event, she stepped outside into the cool air and looked up at the sky, the stars above her, calm and distant. Didn't realize Keanu was beside her until he quietly handed her a cup of tea. Still showing up, huh? He said with a small smile. Away, she replied, the walked together through the quiet street away from the noise, not saying much. Until Keanu asked a question he had never asked before. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't sat beside you that day?" Anna stopped and turned to him slowly. "Do sometimes," she said. "But then I remember something once, that you didn't just sit beside me, you chose to see me when I didn't even see myself, and I think the world needs more of that, people who choose to seek." Keanu nodded and said, "Soft lion, people who choose to stay seen, because you didn't disappear on you lit a path in the years that followed. The Quiet Light Initiative expanded into new places. They launched chapters in schools, partnerships with shelters, and programs in countries where women still had to fight just to speak. But they always kept it small enough to stay personal. Anna refused to let it become a brand, because it was never about her. The meat was about the message. Kindness is not noise, it's person. Choni. Evening, the letter arrived at the foundation. It was handwritten in soft pencil from a woman in a village no one had ever heard of. "Letter ready. Have never seen your films. I do not know your face, but someone showed me your story, and it made me believe that my silence is not weakness. I stand taller now, not because I was saved, but because I was reminded that I'm honored." Anna read the letter aloud to the team, then framed it and placed it beside the very first call sheet, the one with her name crossed out, because that page had once broken hair, and now it reminded her how far she had come. One day, Anna was asked to return to the studio where she had been cut years ago. A young director was hosting a workshop for rising actors and had requested her presence. She walked into the same lot. The memories came back, the cold bench, the sound of laughter. She was a part of the silence that had once felt louder than any rejection. But this time it was different. This time, when she entered the building, people stood not because of fame, but because of what she stood for. She took the stage and looked at the young hopeful facets. Then she stayed and rushed to be chosen. Don't lose yourself trying to fit in. Sometimes being overlooked is not a failure, it's a pause, a quiet place where you learn your worth without needing applause. And when the world finally sees you, you'll already know who you are. Rethi listened, not because she was a star, but because she had once been the man. Then a girl in the front row asked, "You would change everything for you?" Anna thought for a moment, then smiled. "A man sat beside me when no one else wouldn't. That taught me everything I needed to know." That same evening, as she walked back to her car, she found a small envelope taped to her door. Inside was a folded paper. It read, "You were never cut. You were just being carved into something stronger. Keep carving. Someone is watching." She didn't need a name to know who it was from, and she smiled the kind of smile that comes from knowing you are no longer alone. Years later, people would still tell her story, not because it was loud, but because it was homestand. One day, a young actress would sit behind a curtain holding a call sheet with her name missing. She would remember Anna's story. She would remember the quote from the quiet light, "Well, you don't need to be loud to be unforgettable." As she was staying, maybe, just maybe, someone would sit beside her too, and that would be the beginning of something beautiful all over again.